Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we are going to look at near-death experience and how one integrates it into their life. With me is Dr. Eben Alexander, who is the author of several books, including Proof of Heaven, The Map of Heaven, and co-authored with Karen Newell, Living in a Mindful Universe. Dr. Alexander is a former professor of neurosurgery at Harvard Medical School. Welcome, Eben.
Well, Jeff, thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
It's a pleasure to be with you. Your book, Proof of Heaven, has been a bestseller now for quite a long time. Millions of copies have been sold. People all over the world are aware of the near-death experience that you had. And I'm sure the fact that you entered into this experience as a materialistic scientist, as a neurosurgeon, makes your story even more compelling. But I think what's interesting today to focus on is what it's like for you looking back on that experience after 10 years. How has it been to integrate that experience? Because it changed your life dramatically.
It changed everything, really. I had to go back to square one in terms of my understanding of the nature of reality. And as much as people kind of marvel at the fact, a Harvard neurosurgeon would go through such an extraordinary kind of process of a near-death experience and come back with this kind of story, to them may seem like, oh my gosh, how in the world does that kind of a coincidence happen? And yet for me, it was simply the soul journey that one would expect. Important to point out that near-death experiences, in spite of the fact that they have tremendous commonalities, which basically indicate that they're referring to one very real realm, and that is independent of one's prior religious beliefs, what country you grew up in, even what millennia you live in. It's astonishing, but there's a commonality. But in addition, each NDE is tailor-made for the soul undergoing it. And so, for me, in looking back on it, it's perfectly natural that for kind of a hardcore materialist neuroscientist like myself, who fully believed that brain creates consciousness, of course, I would have an NDE that would show me kind of the bright edges in reality around my knowledge base and lead me into deeper understanding of something about which I've had a passionate interest my whole life. And that is kind of a deeper understanding of the nature of reality, the relationship between mind and brain, and in fact, therefore, the fundamental nature of conscious awareness itself. So it was really tailor-made to me, but of course, I'd never read the near-death experience literature before. So I had no idea of those commonalities. I had always just thought, well, it's a trick of the dying brain. So, what do they matter? And of course, then having my own was a mind bender. And as expected, as being part of the personal message, it also involved a disease that was in many ways a perfect model for human death. For a neuroscientist interested in understanding brain-mind consciousness, you couldn't imagine anything more perfect than a severe case of bacterial meningoencephalitis. Because what that does is it's like a laboratory prep. It's a perfect model for systematically dismantling kind of the primary engine of detailed conscious awareness, according to modern neuroscience. Because modern neuroscience would tell you that our neocortex, as the most powerful calculator in the human brain, one that is absolutely, according to their view, involved with all of the detailed conscious awareness of everything we've ever experienced, everything that we see, everything we hear, all of our thoughts, the language in our mind, our kind of rational thinking, our sense of free will and of executive function and of perception of body and space. Every bit of that kind of detailed awareness depends on some part of the neocortex still working. And that's why my gram-negative bacterial meningitis with all the neurologic evidence my doctors had of the destruction, not only of my neocortex, but even of my brainstem from day one. I mean, this was a very severe case. And also the scans, CT and MRI scans, revealed that it was a full thickness destruction, that I had swelling all the way down to below the 6 layers of my neocortex to where they intersect with the white matter. So,
in effect, it's a miracle you're alive.
Well, let's put it this way. My doctors estimated when I first got to that emergency room, seizing and in coma, on that Monday morning, November 10th of 2008, that I had a 10% chance of survival. So that's not a miracle. That's a 10% chance. By the end of the week, I was down to a 2% chance of survival.
But then they never thought you would fully recover.
Well, see, that's the part that really is miraculous, and that my doctors to this day would tell you is inexplicable based on Western medicine. Because basically, even though when I woke up in the ICU bed on day 7 of coma, waking up is not really the right word to use, because in fact, when I woke up, all I remembered was my near-death experience, that incredible spiritual journey I had been on. But one anomaly of my experience is the fact that I was amnesic. I didn't remember anything of Eben Alexander's life. In fact, during the entire coma experience, I had no words or language at all. And when I did wake up that day 7 of coma in that ICU bed, with my mother, my sisters, my former spouse, my sons at the bedside, I had no idea who these beings were. That's how kind of wrecked my mind was. But soon after that, they extubated me, and my words and language were coming back very quickly. And within a day or two, I was recognizing people quite readily. In fact, I realized that the 6 faces that I described seeing towards the end of my near-death experience, who I didn't recognize at the time, who would kind of visualize out of the muck and utter a few sounds that I couldn't interpret and then disappear again. 5 of those were people who were physically present in the ICU room the last 24 hours of coma. And notably, there were many family and friends who had been there earlier in the week who I did not remember at all. And so, in fact, those 5 faces that it occurred at the very end of my conscious awareness of the experience helped to frame that the vast majority of the coma experience happened between days 1 and 5, when my doctors knew full well from my neurologic exams that my Glasgow coma scale, which normally ranges from 3 in a corpse to 15 in a normally waking person, with any score below 9 being deep coma. Well, those 5 days when I had all the experience, my Glasgow coma scale was between 5 and 7. So I was in very deep coma. They knew from the scans that the entire neocortex was involved. That's the part that is miraculous, is that all of it came back within really 2 months after coma. All my memories, in fact, my memories came back, and I realized in conversations with family and friends over the next year or two that the memories were more complete after they returned. And to me, it was a very strong indicator that memory is not even stored in the brain. That's something that we cover in detail in the 3rd book, in Living in a Mindful Universe. And it's kind of a shocking reality to modern neuroscientists. But neurosurgeons have suspected for a long time that memories don't seem to be resident in the brain, because mainly, in spite of the millions of neocortical resections, or removal of brain tissue we've done for tumors, vascular lesions, all that kind of thing over the last century, you never have a case where you have a broad swathe of identifiable long-term memories that seem to be deleted by that kind of brain resection. So it doesn't seem that physical memory is there in the brain at all. It's just that our brain serves as an access point to both consciousness and memory. But that is the part that my doctors would tell you today is an absolute miracle, that I could have any experience at all. And that, to me, was the shocker. When I first came back, of course, I had no idea how sick I had been. So I assumed, given that it was way too real to be real, that it had to be a vast hallucination. But then as I went back over the next weeks and months, reviewing my medical records, my scans, talking it all over with my neurologists and with the other doctors, started realizing the medical records I were reviewing were those of somebody destined to die. Certainly not someone who would have a profound experience and then come back and tell the world about it. And that's where I think my story really garnered significant interest in the scientific and medical community. And that's why I've been asked to give talks to medical and surgical and nursing groups around the world, because they recognize the kind of impossibility that I faced in trying to explain my experience against the setting of my medical records, which suggested that it was impossible.
Well, to my understanding, the brain of an adult human being doesn't regenerate itself like the whole neocortex. That's not, known in a child. I'm told the brain is very plastic.
Right. Well, that's very true, that neuroplasticity, the ability of new neurons to form and form new connections and all that, is certainly more robust in children than in adults. And when I trained, I finished medical school in 1980, my residency in 1987. And back in those days, we really didn't believe there was any significant neuroplasticity in adult brains. But we've since discovered that is just not true. People can manifest quite extraordinary modes of recovery. My case is one example, even though it still is something where most doctors would consider it miraculous, that I spent 7 days in coma due to severe bacterial meningoencephalitis, especially a gram-negative, which is the worst kind you can have, even to the point where my cerebrospinal fluid glucose level, which normally would be 60 to 80, and somebody with a very bad meningitis might go down as low as 20. And in my case, it went to 1. None of my doctors or their consultants had ever seen a meningitis case that severe. And that's why I think my doctors to this day, in spite of the fact that, yes, a 2% chance of recovery is not a miracle. It's a 2% chance, 1 in 50. But to recover, that part is really astonishing.
They expected, as I recall, towards the end of the coma, that if you recovered at all, which was unlikely, that you would be spending the rest of your life in a nursing home.
That's correct. They didn't expect any chance of recovering mental function. In other words, no quality of life. And that's why on that seventh day, that morning, seventh day of coma, they had just had a family conference where they reiterated that things just had not worked out well, that I'd been on 3 very powerful intravenous antibiotics for the week. I'd been on the ventilator all week long, but my neurologic condition was really not improving at all. And they thought it would be smarter just to let nature take its course. And the recommendation there was that it was time to stop the antibiotics. And it was a few hours later that I came back to this world. But again, as I said, my doctors were no fools. When I came back, my brain was absolutely wrecked by the experience.
And it took months for you to really...
It did take 2 months for everything to come back. And I would say for the first week or two, it was very frightening for my family to witness, because they thought, oh, this wonderful miracle, he's coming back to us, but oh my God, he's totally wrecked. This is horrible. It would have been better for him to go on and die. That's why the doctors had recommended that course. And yet my recovery was so extraordinary. It just kind of, I came rocketing out of that, to a point where I could even discuss and review my medical records with my doctors within a month or so, which to them was an absolute shocker.
Because immediately when you came out of the coma, I gather you were rather delirious.
Yes, I was, in fact. And that's a beautiful part of the story that I share in Proof of Heaven, because after they extubated me, at the very earliest of my kind of waking up. I really don't remember that. I was told by my family that I was sitting there on the bed like this little Buddha, and I was saying, all is well. Don't worry. All is well. Now, I do not remember saying those words, but there were many witnesses, and I'm sure I said it with utter conviction. But the upshot is, even though I had been extubated, and they thought I was waking up, I was kind of in and out of a wild, kind of delusional, paranoid nightmare. But the interesting thing is, even in the midst of that crazy kind of 36 hours of in and out of the nightmare, I knew that was a delusion. I knew it wasn't real. Now, there were parts of it that seemed very real, and I took a little convincing from my family. For example, part of that kind of delusion state had to do with the fact that I was in a cancer ward, a cancer hospital in South Florida. that was many, 3 adjacent buildings with these escalators coming up through it. And I can remember it now. It's kind of a foggy memory of things, even though at the time it seemed pretty real.
You were in Virginia,
But I was in Virginia. I was actually in Virginia. And that's the part where my family challenged me on, and especially challenging me on how I got there. Yeah. And I knew the system that had got me there in this crazy nightmare was a made-up system of underground tubes and trains. And I remember this elaborate system of getting me there. But the interesting thing is compared to the memories from deep coma, you know, the spiritual journey that I report in Proof of Heaven that happened when I had a documented Glasgow coma scale of 6 to 7, deep coma, documented CT and MRI evidence that all 8 lobes of my brain had full thickness inflammation from this destructive and should have killed me bacterial meningitis. Those memories are sharp and clear, as sharp today as if they happened yesterday. The deep coma memories. Whereas those kind of paranoid, delusional ICU psychosis memories of the South Florida Cancer Clinic and these tube trains underground, all that kind of wildness I knew was a hallucination. So they're very different. And I've since discovered several scientific papers from doctors who study NDEs where they look at the quality of memories over time from a near-death experience versus dreams or psychedelic drug experiences, other imaginatory experiences, or real-life experiences like a car wreck or something that really sticks in your mind. And the interesting thing that these scientists have uncovered about near-death experiences, including scientists both in the U.S. and in Europe, are that the near-death memories are far more stable and resilient over time. And that's something that makes perfect sense to me because I've given more than 400 talks to audiences around the world about my experience, and I very often have people coming up to me after these talks, many of whom are completely naive to the NDE literature, and they will come up and say, I've never told anybody this before, but... And then they'll share a story with me that happened to them. It could have happened 60 years ago. And yet they claim to remember it as clearly as if it just happened yesterday. These stories are very extraordinary. They are not hallucinations. They are not dreams. They're not the effect of drugs unless you have, you know, documented evidence of a certain psychotomimetic kind of drug that's on board at the time. And in fact, there's recently been a case report on my medical records that I think is very important for this world because there was a lay press article about my case that was completely erroneous and misinterpreted many facts of my life and was basically an ad hominem attack. And that article tried to portray that I was in a coma only because of pharmacologic manipulation, failed to acknowledge that I was in deep coma from the moment, you know, that I was taken by the EMTs from my home. I was in deep coma already, long before any IVs or drugs went in, and stayed in that coma all week long, and in fact was still on very heavy sedation when I came out of coma. But anyway, that case report will come out. It's authored by Bruce Grayson and his co-investigators at UVA. It'll come out in the Journal of Nervous and Mental Diseases in September of 2018. So that's immediately upon us, and it makes a very clear case that I was in deep coma due to severe brain damage from meningitis. And the reason that's important to the medical community is because a coma, because of destruction of the neocortex, should get rid of any hallucination, dream, or drug effect of conscious awareness because of that global destruction of the neocortex.
Well, one of the unique features that you describe, and I haven't encountered this in other accounts of near-death experience, is that when you first, in effect, arrived in this alternative reality, you found yourself sort of embedded in an unpleasant muck of some sort.
Well, it sounds foreboding and kind of unpleasant, but given that I was totally amnesic, so this is like my birth into the universe as an awareness. I had no memories of Earth or humanity or being Eben Alexander, none of the words or language, religious concepts, none of the scientific knowledge. None of that made it through. And that tabula rasa, or empty slate, I think was very important for the journey I had to go through. And that only became clear in the months and years after the coma, just how critical that empty slate was. But that was part of the teaching about the brain-mind connection and about the nature of consciousness, was the fact that I had to delete all memories, in a sense, to go through it all. And then, of course, the fact that all my memories came back even better than they were before in the 8 months after coma. But I think that empty slate was very important. So it all started in what I call the earthworm's eye view, like being in dirty jello. And I even though I had no body awareness during any part of the journey, I was a piece of awareness, and I could sense around me. And I remember roots or blood vessels or something that were just everywhere. And given that I had no memory moment to moment, it seemed to go for eons. But it didn't. It ended because there came this slowly spinning, very clear white light that had fine silvery and golden tendrils off of it. And as that white light came towards me, one of the most beautiful aspects of it, it came packaged with a perfect musical melody. And the notes of that melody proved crucial. Just as human beings have used sound, for tens of thousands of years to get into altered states of conscious awareness. For example, the didgeridoo, which I think is one of the most healing musical instruments on earth, supposedly has been around for 40,000 years. And sound, vibration, frequency not only works to take us out of the four-dimensional space-time of this very dense material realm to help liberate our conscious awareness, but also sound serves as kind of a vehicle for traversal of multiple spiritual realms. And that's what I first learned with that spinning melody of light that ushered me up out of that ugly earthworm eye view realm into this beautiful gateway valley that in many ways was much more real than this world. And it was a world with beautiful, lush plant growth everywhere, and all of it growing, very dynamic and actively growing. There were no signs of death or decay anywhere. And I remember sparkling blue waterfalls into these crystal blue pools, and there were thousands of beings down below us, all dancing. And when I came back to this world and tried to put words to it and tried to write all this down, I labeled those as souls between lives. They were dressed in kind of very simple kind of peasant garb, but in beautiful colors, colors beyond the rainbow. And there was lots of joy and merriment going on. There were children playing and dogs jumping, incredible festivities down below. And I was witnessing it because I was a speck of awareness on a butterfly. And on this butterfly wing, there were millions of other butterflies, and they were looping and spiraling in these vast formations. And I remember witnessing all that. And the reason all this was so natural and seemed perfectly real to me was because up above were these swooping orbs, golden orbs of light, each one seeming to be a pure spiritual essence. And they were leaving these sparkling golden trails against this blue-black velvety sky. And the entire scene was just lit by these billowing clouds of pure color. But these swooping orbs up above were emanating chants and anthems and hymns that would just thunder through my awareness and just resonate, this incredible power of oneness, of identification. It's one of the reasons why it's so difficult to explain these journeys is we're not just seeing with the eyes or hearing with the ears, which are very kind of filtered and limited sensory modalities. And in these realms, in these spiritual realms, we become all of it. You can essentially see through everything because you're becoming it and forming this beautiful model of all of it that transcends four-dimensional space-time. It's an extremely elaborate form of knowing.
It's amazing you can put it into words at all.
Well, I wrestled and struggled with the words in Proof of Heaven, trying to get it right. And at the end of the day, I finally felt like the words were about as good as the words I could do. And I often feel that way in some of my discussions of it in presentations and interviews and conferences. But in fact, you're absolutely right. You cannot put it into words. And that's one of the reasons why I think people also confuse very much. There are a lot of people out these days who say, oh, sounds like a DMT trip, dimethyltryptamine, which is a hallucinogen that purportedly is found in minute amounts in human beings, although that is somewhat up to debate. But the reality is the words may sound the same, but the words are not really describing the fullness of the journey. And so I would just caution you to know that, no, this is much more than a psychedelic drug trip in terms of its reality, in terms of its meaning. In fact, there have been direct comparisons of that in the scientific literature. And they basically find that all the transcendental aspects of a near-death experience, like encountering souls of departed loved ones, and that full-blown oneness with the power of pure love at the creative source of the universe, and a lot about life mission and seeing one's future, things like that aren't as readily apparent in a psychedelic drug trip, but they certainly come through in robust fashion in the more profound near-death experiences.
Well, there was also, if I recall, a timeless quality. It felt like you might have been there for years.
Well, that is, it actually triggered off a tremendous interest I have in the nature of time. And the one thing that it became very clear to me is that what we see as past, present, future is very much a fiction. And in fact, when you get into conventional science, whether you're talking about relativity and the way it looks at time, and how time and space are interchangeable, or you look at quantum physics and the way that it kind of portrays basically a time flow that can go in loops. Really the only thing that gives us a direction of time in our human kind of macro-sized world, halfway between the size of a quark or an electron and a galaxy, is the second law of thermodynamics, which is a statistical law that simply talks about order and disorder in large numbers of particles. And that's what basically gives us an arrow of time. But other than that, in terms of our world of physics, time should easily flow both directions. And yet we always seem to have this sense that it only goes in one direction. Now, in my journey, I had to even label something that I call deep time. And I've heard the phrase deep time used by others in slightly different ways. But I think all of us are trying to converge on the notion. For me, deep time is a complete different ordering of causality that you have to invoke in connecting to those realms. For example, that Gateway Valley was only a stepping stone on my way out. And of course, we can discuss more about that stepping stone and where it was leading. But that would be the same realm where we go through life reviews, where we reunite with our higher soul at the time of leaving the physical body. And the life review is very important. It's been described by near-death experiencers going back at least 2,400 years. Plato writes about the Armenian soldier killed in battle. He was out dead on the battlefield for several days before they finally collected all the bodies, put them on a funeral pyre. And just before they lit it, came back to life. And essentially, kind of the journey he portrayed is that when you die, you go through a review of the most important kind of pertinent lessons still to be learned. So if you're one of those who handed out pain and suffering to others, as soldiers often do, you got to be ready to face that. We reap what we sow. In essence, the life review is a beautiful example of how the boundaries of self are a fiction. They support the drama of this world where we have apparent separation of self from other self. And yet in a life review, you experience the impact not only of your actions, but even of your thoughts on those around you. And you experience it as they experience it. That's why it's such a good course corrective to help us learn to treat others.
And this was part of your experience?
It was part of the experience. That's why we should treat others as we would like to be treated. I mean, you could almost look at it as a neutral ground, even though in that life review setting,
Mm-hmm.
It's in that infinite ocean of pure, unconditional love of that God force that, of course, is what so many near-death experiences bring back to this world and know full well in their own heart and their emotional state. There's nothing to fear about death because it's a reuniting with that ocean of absolute warmth and love and kindness and compassion and mercy of that creative source of this universe.
But the idea that you are experiencing the pain and also the joy that you are responsible for in other people, but experiencing it through their eyes,
right,
as they
and their feelings,
and
their
feelings.
Heart. Yeah, and that's a good reason to remember to treat others as we would like to be treated.
It also suggests that at some level of our consciousness, we are everyone.
We are. Absolutely. That, I think that is something that we make a very clear point of in our third book, In Living in a Mindful Universe. It was clear to me in my coma journey that we're really sharing one mind. Yeah. That when we die, it's basically like a raindrop falling back into the ocean. In a sense, although it's also interesting that there's this tremendous body of evidence concerning reincarnation. Yeah. And scientific study of reincarnation.
Yes.
So it's not really a question of whether or not you want to believe it or if your religious texts support it. Most religious texts do. In fact, original Christianity fully supports reincarnation. You know, Christ talking about the prophet who was reincarnated as John the Baptist. But it was actually Constantine several centuries later who made any talk of reincarnation punishable by inverted crucifixion. He didn't like that idea because of how it interfered with their ability to control people with what they were putting together at the Council of Nicaea and that kind of thing, of codifying and unifying Christian religious thought. But it's certainly not, reincarnation is completely compatible with early Christianity and other faiths, and then the scientific evidence that supports it today. And for any of your listeners who are interested, I would steer them to I think it's uvadops.org, which is
University
the Division of
Virginia.
Perceptual Studies at University of Virginia, under the guidance initially of Ian Stevenson back in the 60s, 70s, 80s, more recently of Dr. Jim Tucker. They've studied more than 2,700 cases.
Now, we've done extensive interviews on that here on this
Excellent.
channel.
Very good.
Now, let me ask you this question, because you spent your whole life as a materialistic scientist. Now you've had this incredible experience and you're coming out of it, but you also have a lifetime of habits of thinking differently. It must have taken you a while to absorb all of this, to come to the realizations that you now have. They didn't happen overnight.
Well, it didn't. You're right. And yes, it really took going back to square one. I had to question everything, going back to the very beginning. That includes any of the assumptions I had about the nature of reality. And one of the most fundamental assumptions in conventional materialist neuroscience is that only the physical world exists. And if only the physical world exists, then somehow you've got to come up with a way to explain consciousness and mind based on the physical workings of the brain.
Right.
And that's where it hits an absolute wall. Back in the mid-1990s, David Chalmers wrote his book, The Conscious Mind. Which was really a consolidation of several decades of work from around the world that were pointing out the lapses, that all the workings of the brain do not explain the workings of the mind. In fact, I very much revere the work of Wilder Penfield. He was one of the most renowned neurosurgeons of the 20th century. He was Canadian, worked out of Montreal. And he is in better position than just about anybody on earth to comment around the brain-mind connection, because a lot of his work involved electrically stimulating the brain in awake patients.
He was a neurosurgeon.
He was a neurosurgeon
like yourself,
who dealt with epilepsy. That was one of his big topics. And to resect the part of the brain that causes the epilepsy, often you have to map it out. It turns out the brain feels no pain at all. I've done several hundred of those cases myself, awake craniotomies in patients where you map out the brain by electrically stimulating, then having the patient report to you what kind of memory or sensation they have during that electrical stimulation. And initially, Penfield thought he was hot on the trail of uncovering the source of memory. But then he came to realize, well, even if he resected a part of brain that he thought contained the memory, that memory could still be very robust in that patient. So he realized it wasn't so simple. And in fact, he wrote a book in 1975 that summarized his life experience in such cases. That book is called The Mystery of the Mind. And in that book, he makes it clear time after time after time, all throughout the book, that you cannot explain mind and consciousness based simply on the workings of the brain. Not only that, you would never find anything resembling free will in the brain itself. That consciousness and free will and he was extrapolating to the point of saying memory too, because he eliminated the possibility that memory seemed to be in the neocortex.
But generally, the profession, as much as they revere Wilder Penfield, they didn't follow him that far.
Well, it's a real tragedy. We actually met one of his team in Montreal who had been involved in his medical care, who said that when he published that book, it was a year before he died of cancer. And that the kind of story on the streets there at the Montreal Neurologic Institute were that basically the cancer had influenced his thinking. So it was a very kind of cheap cop-out. Anybody who reads the book will realize his thinking was not at all impaired. It's a very insightful, reflective book. I've read of a lot of his other work around that time, the foundational work from the 1940s and 50s in his scientific papers that led to those conclusions. He was very clear of mind and couldn't have been clearer on an interpretation of the data. And yet the world, the scientific world in particular, was not ready to hear in 1975 that the brain was not the producer of consciousness.
I mean, you got trained as a neurosurgeon after that.
Much after that.
And you had no problem, I imagine, assuming that consciousness was a product of the brain.
That's what I was taught, and that's what I believed. Now, the important thing to point out is that if we take that supposition and then we go to a modern neuroscientist or philosopher of mind and we ask them, oh, the brain produces consciousness. Tell me more. They won't have anything to say. There is nothing there. There are some vague kind of theoretical models that talk about information processing and information ordering and make some big assumptions about how that might somehow work in the brain. But in terms of actually having any notion whatsoever about how the neurons in the brain, the 100 billion nerve cells in the brain interacting give rise to consciousness, nobody has the remotest clue.
I have heard speculation about neural loops and feedback, cybernetic feedback loops within the nervous system. It's about as close as I've ever heard.
Well, they have some working models that seem to be kind of okay at their very primitive level. And those models basically involve, as I mentioned earlier, the neocortex is the main calculator. That's by far the most powerful calculator in the brain. In fact, it's amazing how those 6 cell layers in the neocortex have been modified to do so many functions. I mean, everything that we see, everything that we hear, our body position in space. I mean, all of what I see out there, you've got to remember, none of that is happening out there. Every bit of what we sense is out there is actually an internal construct within mind that we think is a fairly faithful model of what is out there. Now, you can show through, for example, mismatches between visual and tactile stimuli. You can easily demonstrate ways to fool that system into thinking certain things. But then where we really run into a wall is with quantum physics itself. And that's kind of another topic. But the reality is what we end up finding in the world of quantum physics, and the reason it's been so mystifying over so many years, is that it really is the most fundamental way of asking the brain-mind question. And it's one reason why materialist science has gotten so kind of hopelessly lost in trying to understand it all. But it's really all implying that fundamental nature of consciousness, which of course is something that we explain soup to nuts in pretty full detail in that third book, Living in a Mindful Universe. But it's that much deeper kind of understanding that was forced on me. And it's really one of the biggest smoke and mirrors tricks of 20th and early 21st century science that the public at large still seems to believe that modern science, and especially neuroscience, is so good that they're almost on the verge of describing consciousness. And in fact, they're almost on the verge of describing exactly how the brain is not the producer of consciousness at all, but that consciousness is something far more fundamental. That's what they're on the verge of. But that science, that cutting edge of science, fully opens the door not only to the reality of the afterlife, but of reincarnation. So in other words, we just need a much bigger theater of operations to really kind of understand where all this is headed. But the general models you're referring to would involve that neocortex as the final kind of calculator, but it's interactions of the neocortex with the thalamus, which are the deep gray structures, fairly substantial structures, but still a more advanced part of the brain. I mean, you can find the thalamus in animal systems going back, at least 100 million years.
The mammalian brain, basically.
Mammalian brain, exactly. Yeah. But it turns out that also modern neuroscience would involve deeper, more primitive structures going down into the brainstem that actually play a role in kind of igniting and unifying consciousness.
Well, I hope we can have a separate conversation.
We can do that. There's much more to say about that.
But I'm interested in not just the intellectual integration that you've obviously been engaged in as a professor yourself, but the what it meant for you emotionally, spiritually to change your life completely as a result of this experience.
Well, I was at a meeting in Paris, France, about a year and a half ago, and it was a big scientific meeting on NDEs, and they had a lot of scientists there who were fully informed about the profound kind of spiritual implications of near-death experiences. But still, some of the scientists, when they would hear me talk about my experience, and of the kind of heartfelt, the love, because as I put it in Proof of Heaven, one of the deepest scientific truths of my journey to me, when I came back from it and began interpreting it, was that ultimate healing power of love. You cannot get away from that. And if you try, as a scientist, we got to keep this in a very kind of cognitive, intellectual setting. When you've been there and touched that and dipped into it and felt the power of it and what it gives NDEers, you cannot deny the emotional, heartfelt, loving nature of the journey. And also I would say that I've come to realize much more fully how all of this, the physical, the mental, the emotional aspects of each and every one of us depends ultimately on kind of the spiritual aspects. And that's what all of this discussion is about. Discussion about consciousness in general, relationship of brain and mind, the very existence of the soul. Every bit of that you cannot get away from that concept of love and of the oneness of mind. I think that's one of the most important concepts. You brought that up a little while ago. To your interested readers, I would point out that excellent book by Dr. Larry Dossey, The One Mind. And One Mind, it's an incredibly powerful book. It's a topic he took on because he was an identical twin. And he knew that he seemed to have kind of a telepathic connection with his twin. And of course, anybody who studies twins will realize that that's pretty easily demonstrable in twin populations. But then what most people don't realize is you can also demonstrate telepathy in other people. And there are ways to kind of set the stage to enhance your telepathic skills. And a lot of that telepathy is even more powerful when you invoke kind of heart consciousness and the emotional power. Because if all you're trying to do is be telepathically connected to cognitive constructs, they don't have the same kind of weight and kind of resonant power that you can find in emotional constructs. And that's why telepathy and empathy, often can work hand in hand, and we can really have those strong interconnections. In some of the twin studies, their connection is so strong that, for example, one twin might burn his finger on a stove, and the other twin 1,000 miles away is the one who develops the blister.
Isn't that amazing?
So, yeah, it's astonishing. But people need to realize this connection goes very, very deep. Mm-hmm. And it's much more than just a subtle mental connection. It can be a very powerful physical connection, too, in a sense.
Mm-hmm. Did you regard yourself as an atheist prior to that experience?
Well, I had grown up in a Methodist church in North Carolina. I would say my father, my adopted father, who was an academic neurosurgeon, and he was a beautiful mentor to me and resource and kind of a role model. Mm-hmm. He had been a combat surgeon in the Second World War, and I think he got through that conflict relatively unscathed because of his religious beliefs. He came back to be a chairman of a neurosurgical training program in the U.S., and it never conflicted at all with his faith in God. He had a very profound sense of the reality of God, the power of prayer, and yet he was also extremely scientific, could have easily discussed the Big Bang and evolution with you as easily as neuroscientific concepts. But going to that Methodist church, I remember thinking I was so smart because I knew science was the pathway to truth. Mm-hmm. Even in sixth grade, getting into some lively discussion with my confirmation teacher. Now, I went into my early career wanting to believe in all of that I learned in that church. But I must admit I had greater and greater difficulty coming up with any mode of understanding of how conscious awareness could survive the death of the brain and body. Mm-hmm. And then as I tell the story in the book Proof of Heaven, in the year 2000, my faith had a really tremendous shaking. It has to do with the fact that I was adopted. I had reached out to the children's home in North Carolina back in my teens and 20s, looking for my birth mother, thinking she might be out there. And they kept getting back to me, no, she's not looking for you. Forget about it. Mm. So fine. I'd been adopted into a loving family. They'd honored all my hopes and dreams. I could go with that. And that's the way I left it until decades later, early 2000, when my oldest son, Eben IV, who was then in sixth grade, Charles River School, Dover, Massachusetts, had a school project in family genealogy. Mm. And it was that school project where he said, no, Dad, we have to find out more about your birth family. Mm-hmm. So he encouraged me to write another letter to the children's home, which I did, fully expecting to get the same answer I'd always gotten before. No, she's not out there. Forget about it. And this time I got a different answer. Mm-hmm. In a 2-minute phone conversation with a social worker, I found out that my birth parents had actually gotten married. Mm. And not only that they had 3 children, mm-hmm. but that their youngest child, a sister, had died 2 years earlier. That would have been 1998. Mm-hmm. They were still grieving her loss, so it was not a good time to come back in their life. Mm. And then that was the end of the phone call. And I didn't realize it until months later, but that phone call was a real burner. It sent me into a dark night of the soul. I stopped taking my sons to church. I stopped saying prayers with them at night. I just gave up on I became agnostic is the way I would put it. Mm-hmm. That there was no way that I saw evidence that prayer was real, that there was a loving personal God out there. And I just dropped it all until my near-death experience, my coma, showed me very clearly how that was all totally wrong.
Because in your near-death experience, there was a portion of it, even above that beautiful verdant valley with the butterflies and the music, where you felt you were in direct communion with the creator of the universe.
That is, yes, that's a beautiful part of the story. And really, I would have to take us back to that butterfly wing, the millions mm-hmm. of butterflies looping and spiraling above this valley. Yeah. Ultra real, mm-hmm. much more real than anything I've ever experienced here. That's the hard part for people to get. And yet more than half of NDEers talk about how much more real that realm is than this one. But the good news is I wasn't alone on the butterfly wing. Mm-hmm. There was a beautiful young woman. And I'll never forget her appearance. She was dressed in the same kind of simple peasant garb that the people down in the valley, all the dancers, were dressed in, but lovely colors. Mm-hmm. And I'll never forget her sparkling blue eyes, her high cheekbones, high forehead, broad smile, soft light brown hair. And she never said a word to me, but she didn't have to. And she looked at me with this look of pure love. And I remember around the same time I was aware of her presence, there was this soft summer breeze that blew through. And even though the scene looked the same, it changed everything. That soft breeze, as I referred to it in my writings, was like a divine wind or the breath of God. And that was my first kind of knowing. Given that I was amnesic for everything, I was learning about these realms for the first time. That was my first awareness of the power of that divine force of love, that God force, in creating every bit of it. Even the lower four-dimensional space-time that I knew was down below the spiritual realm. All of that spiritual realm with its deep time, the place where we'd have life reviews and all of that. But that soft summer breeze was that divine wind. And yet what happened next was the most stunning. And that's where those swooping orbs of angelic choirs above provided portals to higher and higher levels of awareness, all the way out to what I call the core. And the process of getting there was witnessing not only four-dimensional space-time collapsing down, but several of these layers of deep time and of spiritual kind of organization and causality all collapsing down. And in the core, that really cannot be put into words at all. I often use an analogy of it being like on the very edge of the event horizon of a black hole, where you're kind of oscillating between pure absolute oneness, affinity, eternity, love, God force, and the first stages of parcellation. As in the highest spiritual realms, it starts to split out into any kind of separation of that God force. And in that core realm, the whole higher dimensional multiverse had been compressed into what I call the oversphere as part of the lessons. And there was a sense there that even though all of eternity and infinity could be represented as this little ball, there was still beyond that infinite dimensionality of infinity all overflowing with pure wholeness of love, of the love of the Creator for the creation, or the best way I can use words to describe it. And there was a brilliant light that was there as this interpreter or translator. But at times, because of that same oscillation on the event horizon, I was totally one with every bit of the oneness. You know, to talk about being one with God, I think one of the biggest travesties of some of our religious orthodoxies is they say that cannot be true. And it's because they look at the ego and the human as such a small thing. How can that possibly be on the same terms as that infinite, eternal God force? But in truth, I would say that is our speck of awareness as a conscious being is a very direct link to that God force of pure oneness. And so truly, we are one with that God force. And it should be obvious to anybody that the petty little ego, the linguistic rational brain, and all the little petty meanderings of humans are way, way, way down below that. But all of us have that awareness. And it's the awareness. That's what Karen and I often teach in our workshops, is developing that sense of the observer within, because that awareness is something that goes all the way to that pure core of the universe. And in that sense, we are all truly one with the divine. And it's what really gives us the power to rise above this myth of the kind of sinfulness and kind of bad boy behavior of all human beings, which is just taken as an assumption. But realizing that that's not who we truly are at our deepest sense of awareness. We are, in fact, one with that God force. And the way I kind of saw it on my journey is I saw that in truth there was no a battle between good and evil, for example, that in fact evil and darkness, and I'm no Pollyanna, there's no doubt of the apparent darkness and evil and kind of bad things that happen to people in this world. But what I saw is that unconditional love has infinite power to overwhelm, because that apparent darkness and evil is only the lack or absence of the light and love, and that any one of us can choose to develop that oneness with the awareness, can choose to be one with an infinitely loving God, and can therefore choose to love ourselves most fully That was another realization of my journey, is that the problem is not that we don't love our neighbors enough or our enemies enough. It's that we fundamentally don't love ourselves enough as those divine, eternal, sacred, godlike beings that we can all find in deep meditation. You know, in life reviews, we can come to realize that we have that within us. I came to see the darkness as really providing stepping stones. That's why I would say that, you know, even illness and injury, I've come to see as beautiful stepping stones. It's how we deal with those things that allow us to grow.
Well, even though this experience for you occurred 10 years ago, I'm under the impression, as you're recounting it, it's still very much alive.
It is absolutely right. I mean, I would say that's another misunderstanding about near-death experiences. People think, well, you have an NDE, then you come back with all the answers. I would say it's a little more accurate to say you might come back with better questions. And certainly better questions lead us towards better answers. But it is a mission in progress. And given my full-blown understanding now that reincarnation is absolutely a real part of the picture, I know that we do this kind of work through multiple lifetimes. But don't worry, you know, learn as if to live forever and live as if to die tomorrow is a perfect guide, because a lot of the knowledge remains with us, even though there is a system of what I call programmed forgetting. And that's easily demonstrable, say, in all of those cases of past life memories in children, indicative of reincarnation, because Jim Tucker and Ian Stevenson will tell you, you need to be asking children those questions between ages 2 and 6. Because after age 6, there are multiple processes that occur that are natural, that have to do with building up the veil, so that we forget the time between lives. We tend to forget past lives and things like that, even though the modern world of transpersonal psychology, thanks to brilliant investigators like Stan Grof, Michael Newton, Brian Weiss, transpersonal psychology shows us that you can best deal with the hardships and difficulties in this lifetime by realizing you set the stage for them in other lifetimes. And if you look at yourself as a multi-incarnated being, then you can start getting at the real root cause of so much of that. And any of the things that were not resolved in a previous lifetime and not resolved in a life review are fair game for kind of challenges and hardships that you'll have to deal with and resolve in this lifetime. It's another very good reason never to succumb to suicide. Suicide is not the correct answer, except in very occasional cases of euthanasia to alleviate suffering in a terminal disease. But otherwise, suicide usually just postpones your having to deal with those particular issues. And if you can't handle them in the life review, then you have to handle them in the next incarnation. So suicide would never be a correct answer.
You have to deal with them in any case.
Yeah, there is no way out but through. That's the way I often put it. We have to deal with the stuff that we came here to deal with. And in fact, the word healing comes from the same word as whole or wholeness and health. And so I would say we're all here in the process of healing. That is becoming more of who we came to this world to be. But that's why it's, I think it was Socrates or back in that age when they said the unexamined life is not worth living. It really is worth reflecting on who we are, why we're here, where this is headed, what our purpose is. And I would say that's the greatest value to the individual for the kind of awakening we're talking about. Because the awakening we're talking about in Proof of Heaven, the Map of Heaven, and especially living in a mindful universe is absolutely upon us. And yes, it does involve the entire scientific community and a paradigm shift of our entire civilization. But in essence, the real power of it is how the individual can take it and run with it, because it's all about free will. And free will is that, $64 million question. Modern materialist science would try and convince you we don't even have free will, because they'd be saying it's all chemical reactions, electron fluxes in the brain, all of material following natural laws of physics, chemistry, biology. So where would you even insert free will? Whereas my journey showed me very clearly, I believe the whole universe exists to support the free will decisions of sentient beings who are temporarily dumbed down to their knowledge of all of it, that their higher soul has between lives, so that we have the emotional buy-in to live these lives. Feel the pain of loss of love, but also feel the glories of love and of embodiment of kind of that divine essence of this universe and our ability to participate in it. Those are all gifts. Dr.
Eben Alexander, what a delightful journey that you are sharing with people. You're a scientist and a prophet.
Well, I would say I'm just an interested, open-minded guy, just like any of us out there who, wants to find these things out. And that's why I often stress with people, you don't need to have an NDE to know all of this by being a conscious, sentient being. If you simply develop a method of meditation. I try to meditate an hour or two a day. I've been doing that the last 8 years or so. It gives tremendous benefits for creativity, for guidance, for insight, for connection, relationships, even connecting with souls of departed loved ones, what have you. But it also gives us a much grander sense of who we are and what we're here to do. And that kind of insight, I think, is absolutely of extreme value, especially in this world we live in with all the social media, all the fake news. There's a lot of nonsense out there, the conspiracy theories. And often by going within and focusing on that heart consciousness and our inner awareness, especially when we realize that that our mind and consciousness are not created by the brain, but are allowed in by the brain in a very limited fashion, then we find that going within consciousness is actually a way of getting out into this universe. So it's a tremendous gift, and all of us can avail of it. And that's something that we like to share on ebenalexander.com. People can find a lot more information about me and about that this pathway of discovery.
Well, thank you so much for being with me.
Well, Jeff, thanks so much for having me. It's been great talking with you.
And thank you for being with us.